on Global Player and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Sir Keir Starmer's defended his plans to impose VAT on private school fees, describing the proposals as a tough choice. The Labour leader's been taking part in an exclusive phone-in on LBC.
I do understand that many parents save hard and work hard to send their children to private schools because they have real aspiration for them. But I also understand that all parents have aspiration for their children, including parents who send their children to a state school.
The Labour leader also said he would renegotiate a better trade deal with the EU. Rishi Sunak will be facing your calls with Nick Ferrari tomorrow morning. Elsewhere, the SNP has called for Labour to commit to scrapping the two-child benefit cap. Reform wants to freeze non-essential immigration, and the Lib Dems are discussing water quality. Search teams are looking for a missing British teenager in Tenerife. 19-year-old Jay Slater from Lancashire was at a festival but hasn't been heard from since yesterday morning. Researchers think artificial intelligence can help identify Parkinson's disease before symptoms appear. It's hoped it will lead to a blood test which could be available on the NHS within 2 years. And police in New York have questioned Justin Timberlake on suspicion of drink driving. He was stopped in the Hamptons earlier. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 49 points at 81.91. The pound buys $1.26 and €1.18. LBC weather showers will fade to leave a dry night for much of the UK, lows of 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening to you. It's 2 minutes past 8. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. On the panel with me today, writer and broadcaster Christina Patterson, James Johnson, co-founder of the polling company JL Partners, who was previously the government's senior opinion researcher when Theresa May was Prime Minister, Sebastian Payne, director of the Onward think tank, who's also columnist for the newspaper, and we hope to be joined in a moment by SetSir Stephen Timms, who's standing again for Labour. He's the UK's trade envoy to Switzerland and to Liechtenstein, my dream job, and who was a cabinet minister in Sir Tony Blair's final government. Lots to talk about tonight. We just had an hour talking about tax. I suspect that subject might come up over the next hour, but lots more too. 0345 6060 973. You can text us on 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
All right, let's go to our first caller. It's Wesley in Gravesend. Hello, Wesley.
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel. Just a quick question. Starmer is being criticised for his past support of Jeremy Corbyn. Why isn't there the same criticism for Sunak or the Tories when Boris Johnson is campaigning for them? After all, they both are disgraced leaders.
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, Rishi Sunak said today that Boris Johnson is publicly backing Conservative candidates through things like video messages and signing letters to voters in swing seats. He says that'll make a difference to the Tory campaign, while Keir Starmer told LBC caller Graham that it was only a purely hypothetical thing as to whether or not he'd have served in a Corbyn-run government after the 2019 election because he didn't think Labour would win prior to polling day. Seb Payne, what do you... I mean, is that a fair point, comparing Boris Johnson to Jeremy Corbyn?
I don't really think it is that Wesley was saying that Boris Johnson is a disgraced leader, and I think that...
Well, he is.
Well, he's no longer leader of the Conservative Party, but I think many Conservatives would not put him in the same category as Jeremy Corbyn in terms of where his views are. And there's a clear kind of prosaic point here that Rishi Sunak is not running against Boris Johnson, where Keir Starmer is running against Jeremy Corbyn. So in terms of their strategy, it's quite clear why it's different. But obviously, you know, the Conservatives are in a bit of a funk at the moment, and particularly in those red war seats, you can see all those videos and endorsements popping up from people who think Boris Johnson would help. And you could imagine if Rishi Sunak could, he'd love to get Boris Johnson on the campaign trail because...
Well, exactly, but it's not full-throated support, is it, to do a few videos and write a few letters? Surely he ought to be out there on the stomp.
But obviously there is history there, as we know, between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, and that's something that has to be balanced out. But I think Boris Johnson will look at the state of the campaign and want to do what he can. And you might see Boris Johnson before the end of the campaign. I think that's not unheard of. But whether that's going to change things enough, probably not at this stage.
What they could do is recreate that famous scene with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown each holding an ice cream cone. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. I mean, I don't think that would really change the Tories' hopes at this thing, an ice cream cone. But I think you can see what they're trying to get at here. But Rishi Sunak has obviously changed his position on this, because he's talked about Boris Johnson and the good that he's done. But famously, back in the summer of 2022, he was the one who probably, brought Boris Johnson's career to an end.
Christina.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I actually agree with the caller. Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Wesley.
But
not Streeting.
he's also welcome to call in, because I do think that Boris Johnson is disgraced. Well, we know he was from the Parliamentary Privileges Committee, but there were plenty of other reasons he was. But I think the thing that's interesting that I don't understand is that the Tories seem to think Boris Johnson is an asset, and he absolutely isn't. I know that the righter wing, the more right wing of the party, adores him, but
even though he's not actually, in classical terms,
he's not right-wing at all. I mean, he's about the most left-wing Tory... He's probably the most left-wing Tory Prime Minister ever. All he wanted to do was spend money and indeed have parties. And it's because of the parties, more than anything else, that he won't be forgiven by people. So I think he is disgraced, and I think he isn't an asset. Obviously, he hates Rishi Sunak, and he's on holiday in Sardinia, I think. So I think we can call it, very light-touch campaigning. But I think there is an equivalence there, yeah.
James, if Boris Johnson came back on the scene, say, sort of 5 days before polling day, would that be transformational to the Tory fortunes, do you think?
When I ask people this question in focus groups, they tend to say that Boris Johnson will be a hindrance rather than a help. He's got a tainted brand with the public still, as Christina says, parties, and also a general sense that he was not perhaps the most competent Prime Minister. Look, I think when we dive into the polls, he does actually poll slightly better than Rishi Sunak with some of those key voter groups, Conservative to Labour switchers, Conservatives who are now undecided, but they're both in deep negative territory. That's a little bit like sort of comparing toxic waste to radioactive waste. They're both in deep negatives. The only exception is with the Conservative to Reform switchers. That's a really important group for Rishi Sunak to try and squeeze as they get closer to July 4th. Rishi Sunak has a net rating of -40 with that group, whereas Boris Johnson is on a rating of +15. So if Boris is very cleverly directed by the Conservatives, then maybe. But Boris Johnson, I imagine, is quite a hard person to direct in a clever and targeted manner, I suspect.
One of our listeners, is it Sarah, says, "Here we go again, trashing Boris. He's not disgraced, so give over." Stephen Timms, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I was cutting it a bit fine. I certainly think Boris is disgraced, because he made a lot of claims about the benefits of leaving the European Union, which just turned out to be untrue. And I think he knew they were untrue when he was making those claims. And people at the time were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But I think it's now clear to a very large majority of those people that those claims were just not true. And, I think the Conservative Party is now reaping the consequences of what happened.
Is it fair to compare him to Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn was never Prime Minister, so I think it's quite hard to compare him to Jeremy Corbyn. Boris has got a clear record that everybody knows about.
Well, so does Jeremy Corbyn. From when he was Labour leader, the things he stood up for was quite clear. It's very different from what Keir Starmer stands for.
But the record of Boris as Prime Minister is a very different thing from the record of somebody as the leader of the opposition. What Boris Johnson said has had long-lasting consequences for the country, and they haven't been good. Yeah. Boris said they wouldn't... He went to the Democratic Unionist Party conference and told them there wouldn't be a border down the Irish Sea a few days after having negotiated that there would be a border down the Irish Sea. And people know that now.
Yeah. Why is it, though, that Keir Starmer finds it impossible to answer this question about supporting Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister? Well, he was in his shadow cabinet, so you would have thought it was a simple answer. If you're in your shadow cabinet, of course you want your leader to be Prime Minister. But he's all over the place on this. It's the only really uncomfortable moments that he's had in this campaign were with Beth Rigby on Sky last week and with Nick Ferrari this morning being asked that same question. He simply hasn't got an answer to it. Why not?
Well, as I understand, the answer that he's given is that he didn't expect Jeremy to be Prime Minister. You know, he was a loyal party.
But he campaigned for him to be Prime Minister.
He did. But he didn't expect Jeremy to win, so he didn't expect him to be serving in a government led by Jeremy Corbyn.
But why did he be in that shadow cabinet then and campaign for him? You know, I was a journalist that covered the 2017 and 2019 campaigns, and Keir Starmer was out exactly. I'm glad someone remembered it. You know, and I was out there, and Keir Starmer never had any equivocation about any of this. He was fully throated behind Jeremy Corbyn as one of the clearest people. So how does it matter whether he thought he was going to win, and what kind of excuse is that?
He's a loyal member of the Labour Party, as I am. I also campaigned for a Labour victory in that general election.
You weren't in the shadow cabinet, though.
I wasn't in the shadow cabinet. I wasn't on the front bench at all, actually. But I nevertheless campaigned for us, as did Keir, and that's what party members are expected to do. I've no doubt there are Conservatives at the moment campaigning for the Conservative Party who are doing it in the expectation that they're not going to be in government after the election.
Perish the thought, Stephen. Well, Grant Shapps obviously comes to mind on that one. Sophie says, this presenter, that's me, is so rabidly right-wing. Corbyn is a man of integrity and honesty. This presenter is a stranger to both qualities. Well, I'll take the brickbat. Is brickbat the right word?
I think that's what you've just received.
It is. Right. Let's go to Chris in Hayes in Middlesex. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Good evening. I'd like to ask the panel, how are they going to tax assets rather than work? Because at the moment, the parties are saying they're not going to tax any work whatsoever, but we all know taxes have to go up. So, in my view, due to the increase in assets from the 80s from Margaret Thatcher, we now need to tax boomers and tell them the truth that you need to pay for it, like Theresa May did with the dementia tax. Is there some sort of dementia tax that the Labour Party are planning to do? Because that's the difficult conversation we need to have with your generation, Ian.
God, it's scared Iain Dale today, isn't it? What kind of assets are you thinking of? Property.
So, for instance, landlords, anyone that owns 2 or 3 properties, we need to tax them. We have to be honest. I think millennials and Generation Z are renting in places. I think there's only a very small percentage that actually own their properties, for instance. A lot of older folk have 3-bedroom houses that are worth £1.5 million. I think Theresa May was correct with the dementia tax policy that we need to tax those assets. It's the difficult conversation in the room. No party's talking about it because they're scared they'd lose electoral votes because, let's be honest, you guys vote. Millennials and Generation Z do not vote. And we need to have... We're getting screwed with student loan debt, income tax higher than anyone else. But yet, boomers, you know, they've got a nice pension waiting for them, a couple of houses, some steady income. We have to be fair. We have to say the truth and tell boomers it's time to pay.
Stephen Timms.
Well, I very much agree that we need young people to vote. I think that's really important. And the fact that young people have voted in much smaller numbers than older people in the last few elections has been a really important fact about how the government has made its decisions. And I really welcome the commitment in the Labour manifesto to give the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. I hope that will just start to redress the balance, because we do need to govern Britain in the interests of everybody, and younger people who are going to have the consequences of these decisions for much longer, in particular. But no, there isn't a kind of secret tax that I'm aware of that Rachel Reeves has got hidden up her sleeve. I mean, I think you raise a fair point. about some longer term issues, and maybe in 5, 10, 15 years time we need to be thinking about those things. But for now, taxes at the highest level it's been for 70 years is continuing to go up because of the freeze on the income tax thresholds. And I think our government, if a Labour government is elected, or whoever is elected, will have to manage within the constraints of the tax take as it's now predicted to be for the next few years, without coming up with, huge extra ones.
James?
Well, I think this is certainly where the debate is going to go. Clearly, the financial situation is pretty bad. It's one of the reasons Rishi Sunak went for an early election, because I think they looked at the numbers and said, we haven't got enough for a big sort of bunch of treats later in the year. Labour are going to face that same problem. They've said they're not going to raise income tax and national insurance. That does box them in, and I think they're going to be looking for easier pickings when it comes to tax. And I think that means things like capital gains tax. I think it means some of those asset taxes that your caller mentioned. I think it potentially means things like dividends tax on the table. Labour are going to be in a very strong position after this election, potentially in terms of seats. I think they will be able to turn around and say, look, the public finances are bad. We need to take some tough decisions. That means some extra taxes on some of these areas. So, yes, I do think that's where the debate is going. I would have one caveat to your caller's point, which is that we polled just this Monday, just yesterday, the most popular policies that have been announced in this campaign so far. And the most popular one with Conservative voters, with Lib Dem voters,
can I guess? And
with Labour voters, go on, Iain.
Fly tipping.
Not quite. Triple lot plus on pensions. The most popular policy even amongst Labour voters, and you know what, it's up in the top 3 with younger voters too. Yeah. So there is
really?
So there's this general, I think there's a general misconception in Westminster that we want to punish younger people, want to punish the old. Actually, these are people's parents and grandparents who have paid into the system, worked really hard, and they want to see those people rewarded. So I would just caution against some of that intergenerational conflict language, because that doesn't really reflect, I don't think, where policy is, but also where the public is either.
Christina?
Well, I agree with a lot of that. I think, it was interesting. I learned for the first time today what a working person was, because I've always wondered, since we all have to work. No, it's a working man or working people.
Right.
Because Labour always uses the phrase working people. I've never known who it is, because most of us, alas, have to work to pay our bills. And apparently it wasn't actually spelt out, but it seems to be someone who doesn't have much in the way of savings, which is a very, that's many, many millions of people in this country. And so the promise that Labour have made is that they won't raise taxes for them, i.e. income tax, VAT and national insurance. But that does leave council tax and capital gains tax, and as you say, dividends tax.
That's the one I'm absolutely sure that in the budget, in October, or whenever it is, Rachel Reeves will stand up and say, well, we've looked at the books, far worse than we thought, which is what every Chancellor says when they get into government. So I'm afraid that we are going to have to put up capital gains tax by probably to the same as income tax.
Yeah, and I think council tax is very likely to rise as well. Now, look, none of us wants to pay more tax, but council tax was set in 1992 or something. It's ridiculous that it hasn't been revised since then. And because public services are in very evident decline, and everybody feels that, there is no way to improve them unless we get some more money. Growth, of course, Labour are talking about growth. Obviously, we all hope we get growth, but it's very likely that there's going to have to be some tax dividend as well. So I think some taxes will have to rise.
So
I'm not sure this conversation about the inevitability of tax rises is the right one, because to the caller's question, this is about housing was where this started. And the fact is we need to build a lot more houses in this country. We've got a deficit of about 1 million houses at the moment. We could build a house every 10 minutes and it would still take about 20 years to fulfil the backlog, never mind where we'll be in 10 years' time on housing. And that's the first fundamental thing we've got to do to make sure more people can get on the property ladder. And then to Christina's point...
Just on that, do you know how many houses we are building at the moment per minute?
I don't, but I think you do.
I do. Because I looked this up because Nigel Farage was saying, well, of course we need to build a house every 2 minutes at the moment. And that's exactly what we are doing, funnily enough, because it's 525,000 minutes in a year. So you divide that by 2, and you get to roughly where we are in house building. It's a little bit less, but not far off.
It's really interesting because that's sort of keeping up with where we need to be, but not dealing with this backlog that's developed over the past 10, 15 years in terms of population growth and not having enough houses. The second point on public services, to Christina's point, I disagree respectfully with her point that we have to absolutely throw more money at public services. The NHS has got more money than it's ever had in its existence, with some huge cash injections, and it has not kept up with where demand needs to be. And on a big part of our public realm, we should be having a conversation about how they are working, what are the structures of them, because I'm certain if Labour wins the election, they will come in, they will do the tax rises you mentioned, Iain, throw more money at the problem. But at the moment, there is a risk that a big part of the public realm just become a black hole, that you throw money in, it doesn't respond to it. So it's not really about taxes, it's about how these parts of our realm need to be improved.
Chris, thank you very much for your question. We'll come to more in just... I did come to you, didn't I?
Can I just
it's just that we're running very late. But
just push back on James's point. I mean, I think if Labour's elected with a big majority, I don't think Rachel Reeves is going to feel, oh, that's all right, then we can put up some taxes. I think the volatility of the electorate at the moment is such that I think a Labour government is going to be very, very careful about keeping to the promises that we've made.
OK, we will move on to more subjects, different subjects in a moment. Keep your calls coming. It's 8:20.
Britain decides. Rishi Sunak takes your calls on Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Tomorrow morning from 7, exclusively on LBC. Over. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
You've got to love the keenness.
8:22 on LBC. We have Sir Stephen Timms with us, Labour candidate. He's the UK's trade envoy to Switzerland and to Liechtenstein. You jammy devil, how did you get that?
It was a great job. I've really enjoyed doing it over the last 3 years or so. And an opportunity, to think about how we will need to develop our trade around the world, including outside Europe, in the future. I've enjoyed it.
And tomorrow, when Scotland plays Switzerland, who will you be cheering for?
I think I'll probably be cheering for Scotland, but, I wish Switzerland well too.
Just calculated how many people of Scottish descent among your voters, haven't you?
I think Scots have probably got a majority over the Swiss in my constituency. Yeah.
He's polled that.
Which obviously we don't mention, because we have to mention all the other candidates if you do mention it, so keep that in mind. Sebastian Payne, director of the Onward think tank. He's a columnist for the newspaper. Christina Patterson, writer and broadcaster. And James Johnson, co-founder of the polling company JL Partners. Right, our next caller is Robbie, who's in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Good evening, all. My question is, this election, having listened to LBC, as we all do, feels like a change election based on what all the voters are saying. So can anyone explain why the two main parties in particular are trying to outdo each other and offering continuity to us?
What a great question. Christina.
Very good question. Because I think we've seen enough volatility over the last 14 years, but in particular over the last 10 years to keep us going for a very long time. Brexit was an earthquake and, in my view, a cataclysm, and almost nobody can identify any benefits. And Nigel Farage, for reasons that remain completely incomprehensible to me, is hardly ever asked how it is that he is kind of being the candidate of change when he was the one who brought us Brexit, which has been this complete disaster. We had the clown show of Boris Johnson's government, Partygate, Dominic Cummings, Barnard Castle. We've had so much drama that I think we had Liz Truss blowing up the economy. I think everybody is just sick of drama. So I think that's why Labour and Sir Keir Starmer are doing, their so-called Ming Vase strategy. Let's just walk very, very carefully, not drop the vase, because I think people they want sensible change. They want to see the back of the Tories, and with any luck we will see the back of the Tories, but nobody wants drama at this point.
No drama Starmer, Stephen Timms.
Well, our party slogan for this election is change. That's the centrepiece of the manifesto. The country does need a change of direction. But I think Christina is right. Nobody wants mayhem, the sort of chaos that we've had over the last few years. So it's delivering both of those things is what we have to do, and that's what our manifesto sets out to do. And I think this mission-driven approach to government that Keir Starmer has set out is actually quite an attractive one, because it gives a clear sense of the direction of what an incoming Labour government, if one is elected, will be aiming to do. Recognising that at the moment the economy is in bad shape and there's not going to be a great deal of money around to spend, at least in the first year or two. So that mission-driven approach, I think, is being successful in communicating to people, we want a big change of direction. This is the new direction we want to go in, but we don't want any more of the chaos.
You say the economy is in bad shape, but inflation has come back to sort of normal levels. Unemployment is at a low level compared to other European countries. Our exports are booming. We're now the fourth biggest exporter in the world. Surely this is actually quite a good time for Labour to take over. It's a bit like 1997 when Ken Clarke would say, well, Labour had a golden inheritance.
Well, I mean, the latest monthly growth figure, I think, was 0.
But the previous quarter was 0.7%.
Investment is poor. We've got a long-term structural problem, partly as a consequence of Brexit. We were told we were going to get frictionless trade with the European Union, and that was never going to happen. It certainly hasn't happened. And small businesses now trying to export to Europe are an extraordinarily difficult situation, absolutely tied up in bureaucracy and red tape. We've got to sort that out. So there's a big economic repair job to be done, and we hope 2 or 3, 4 years' time we'll be in better shape. But what we can do now, and the missions are enabling us to do that, is setting out a clear future direction for the country, which I think a large number of people are finding attractive.
Sebastian?
I think there's a big danger with this election campaign because it is a change election. I think if you've knocked on doors or looked at focus groups, the sort that James does, it's very clear that people want something different. It's why they voted for Brexit in 2016. It's why they voted for Boris Johnson in 2019, and why they might be voting for Keir Starmer in 2024. What worries me is what happens if we don't get that change, that if all this kind of stability and continuity from both parties ends up as business as usual, because in his launch, Keir Starmer made a big point talking about we're going to grow the economy, and that's what Liz Truss said. It's what every Prime Minister says. But what if the economy doesn't grow? What if we don't solve illegal migration? And I think that potentially leads to a situation where you get some populist forces on the left and from the Green Party and the right in terms of Reform and Nigel Farage. And we've seen from across Europe over the past couple of months what happens when the centre doesn't deliver on what people need. So I think I can understand for electoral reasons why both parties want to do steady as she goes and sort of take the Ming vase over the dance floor without it falling over. But I think on the other side, there are some big challenges as a country. We do need to solve growth. We do need to get legal and illegal migration down to more sustainable levels. We do need to build more houses. We do need to hold the water companies to account. All the parties agree on that. But when you look at what they're talking about, it's not really speaking to that aspiration at the moment.
James?
Well, I think this, to get to Robbie's point there, why is this? I think a lot of it is because politicians are quite scared and they're listening maybe a little bit too much to polls and focus groups from people like me. It might be. Look, Labour are obviously doing it because they've seen election after election after election where voters have worried about them spending too much money, or they're worried about them increasing tax. So therefore, they've sort of really taken that fear on board and therefore taken a very steady as she goes approach. The Conservatives have sort of ended up in a place of sort of just having to shout, don't change, because that's pretty much the best line they've got. I actually think that's probably a mistake, and that they were better around the narrative of the conference when Rishi Sunak said, I'm a bit different to others, and he should have leaned a little bit more into that. Look, that has worked out quite well for Labour. Clearly, it's going to get them an electoral victory, but it does, as Seb says, it does open up space for parties like Reform. And I promise I'm not picking on Stephen here, because it's the Labour line, but listening to Stephen, they say, mission-driven government and lines like that. I mean, the general public roll their eyes at these sound bites, and Rishi Sunak's got plenty of them too. That opens up, I think, space for the Nigel Farage brand of politics, the frank speaking, the sense that he's going to tell it how it is. In our most recent poll, he is seen as the leader most likely to tell it how it is by the public. And so that's because some danger there, I think.
I mean, you look at the two debates that I don't know if you've ever watched them, but the two 7-way debates that he's appeared in, where he's appeared very calm, not the sort of like aggressive Nigel Farage that we've come to know, and I can't believe the broadcasters allow them all to use an autocue to do their closing statements. To my mind, if you got anything about you ought to be able to speak for 90 seconds or whatever it is into a camera. And Nigel Farage made a point of saying, well, of course, I don't need an autocue, I'm genuine. And people would be nodding at that, thinking, yeah, why are all these others doing it?
But look at when Rishi Sunak is asked a question in an interview. He answers sort of half the question and defaults back to the line to take. Yeah. And this is a problem that Tory politicians and Labour politicians have done for years and years and years. I'm constantly baffled by it. And I work for Theresa May. She had the same issue. And I think it's
scars on your back.
I think it's drilled into the Tory politicians of this generation, at least, who learnt this in CCHQ in the early 2000s. It's the way to do things. Perhaps in Labour links back to Blair, but the public look at it and they absolutely detest it. They look at Farage and they go, "Well, I'll have some of that, please."
Yeah. But I find it sorry.
No, but that's a shtick as well. Like Nigel Farage is saying it as it is as much of a kind of thing that he's learned how to do as politicians that say the kind of lines that they are given to.
They've handed that to him on a plate.
I agree. And the problem is that when you look at the complexity and the enormity of these problems we face as a country, the kind of solutions that politicians like Stephen put forward can often sound quite technocratic, whereas Nigel Farage talks very populist and it sounds easy and straightforward. That's very beguiling to people, but it doesn't solve the problem. No. And we end up in the same mess that you often end up in.
That's true, but the mess we're currently in is because Boris Johnson has very much the Farage gift. He can speak in that sort of off-the-cuff way. People loved it. He was funny. He is extremely funny. And he was, apparently human, speaks human in that awful phrase that was used of Ed Miliband, who it turned out didn't speak human. I think it's very sad. I think that Keir Starmer probably is a very genuine person. People privately say he has great charisma, but unfortunately, as soon as you stick him in front of a TV camera, he's like, some bank manager. But, never mind. I think he will probably do a reasonably decent job. But this whole idea that I think the fact that we have been fed Boris Johnson promising us that there were simple answers to Brexit, there was never, ever, ever an answer to Brexit that would give us what they claimed he would give us, which was, free trade and all the rest of it. I think many people have become suspicious of that. And although, of course, there is support for reform, I think give them a few years to show their colours. At the moment, they are just insurgents. Once they have been answering questions or, speaking publicly about their policies and people actually get a chance to scrutinise them, I think that popularity might wane.
It's very interesting. We had a caller in the last hour who was a former Labour voter who was very unhappy with policy on council tax, so says he's going to vote for reform. And I said, well, what's reform's policy on council tax? I haven't got a clue what it is. He said, well, I don't know.
Yeah, well, protest people. Yeah, I mean, that gave us Brexit again. People just thought they were voting. Basically, it was two fingers, wasn't it? For many, many people, it was just two fingers because they didn't like something in their life and were promised that Brexit would be the answer.
Right. Well, we've got a very interesting question coming up. Do stay tuned. It's 8:33. Let's get the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Sir Keir Starmer would not rule out council tax rises during an exclusive phone-in with LBC. The Labour leader also rejected calls to scrap the two-child benefit cap as Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak will be taking calls with Nick Ferrari on LBC tomorrow. Researchers think artificial intelligence can help identify Parkinson's disease before symptoms appear. It's hoped it could lead to a blood test which could be available on the NHS within 2 years. And Sir Ian McKellen has said he's looking forward to returning to work as he thanked the medical staff who cared for him after he fell from a West End stage on Monday night. In a statement, he's thanked everybody for their kind messages and support. LBC weather showers will fade to leave a dry night for much of the UK and a low of 5 degrees.
Britain decides. Follow the general election and have your say only with LB. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Simon in Guildford says, where does the figure that Iain Dale has just produced that says the UK is the 4th biggest exporter in the world come from? The Office for National Statistics, Simon. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Sir Stephen Timms. How do you like being called Sir Stephen?
I'm very pleased to be called it, but I'm happy with Stephen equally.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I have various sirs come on the programme and they always say, well, can you not call me sir? And I'm thinking, well, if you don't like it, why did you accept it? But there we go. Sebastian Payne, Christina Patterson and the yet-to-be knighted James Johnson.
Sir Christina Patterson, if you don't mind.
Dame. I think that would really suit you. Dame Christina. Absolutely. Well, you call yourself Queen Christina on your Twitter, don't you?
Indeed. Let's keep it regal.
Right, Chris is in Richmond. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel. Isn't it about time we started talking in this election campaign about immigration in a slightly more positive manner?
Who would you expect to do that?
All parties. Because if anyone on that panel, even Nigel Farage or Richard Tice tomorrow had a stroke and the only available doctor was from Afghanistan or Bangladesh, do you think they'd turn down treatment? I don't think so.
Well, of course they wouldn't. This is a really interesting one, which I struggle with on this programme because it's a sort of trope that, all phone-in programmes are sort of saying, let's get rid of all the immigrants. And from time to time, I do an hour on the benefits of immigration because nobody else is doing that. No politician ever talks about the benefits of immigration. Seb Payne, why not?
I think it is something that is overlooked in our debate because the fact is that immigrants bring a lot to our economy. They bring a huge amount to our culture as well. And I think if you look at how our society has been enriched over the past couple of decades, a lot of that is due to immigration. I think the reason we're in the conversation we have at the moment, which is quite negative, is because of the levels that immigration have reached, that we've had political parties for many, many years promising one thing and doing another. So it has become a kind of democratic issue that in 2010, 2015, 2016, 2017 and 2019, the Conservatives all pledged to reduce migration, first the tens of thousands, now below 250,000. The Labour Party pledged controls on immigration and has said similar things in this election as well. And each time that doesn't happen, and so for a lot of voters, they look at politicians saying one thing and doing the opposite, and that feeds this negative narrative. And I think even if you had, as the caller said, Nigel Farage and Richard Tice on this programme, they would accept there is a good role for immigration in this country, particularly high-skilled immigration, where there are clear benefits from both sides. But I think the levels are now so high that we have to do something about it. But we shouldn't end up in xenophobic language. We shouldn't end up in racist language. We've heard some dog whistling from some people on this. But if we solve the levels of immigration, that will allow us to have a better conversation. That was what was meant to happen after the Brexit referendum. It was meant to be a safety valve in some respect on what people think about it. But people have seen the opposite of what they voted for. They wanted more control and lower numbers. We've ended up with much higher numbers and less control, and that's why you see all this angst around the debate.
Stephen Timms, even Labour politicians in this election campaign, I've yet to see anyone make any positive remark about immigration. It's all about wanting to lower it. And I mean, it goes back to the previous question about continuity, and that both parties seem to have some sort of continuity agenda here. Now, you're not in government. You represented and are standing in a constituency of a very high immigrant population. You can surely be positive about it.
I can, and I'm glad to be. I mean, most of my constituents, as you say, are either themselves migrants or are the children of migrants. My former constituents, thank you, and my hopefully future constituents. And so, yeah, I'm very clear about the benefits for London, for the UK, of the contribution that they make. I mean, I think it is important that people have a sense that this is all managed. I mean, one of the things that struck me in the Brexit debate was a lot of people who were themselves migrants were talking to me about their unhappiness about European migration. And, you know, they were sort of rather intimidating groups of men hanging around on street corners, and they thought some people thought if they voted to leave the European Union, then that problem would be solved. You know, I think as long as people have a sense that this is all being managed and properly controlled, then people are able to recognise the very substantial benefits and indeed importance of migration to the economy. We've had all this stuff about sending people to Rwanda in the last couple of years, and that seems to have ended in a complete fiasco as far as I can see. It's not delivered at all. And I do think that this conversation and others are needed to just highlight how much we depend on people who come to the UK and work extremely hard.
And Christina, leadership is something that politicians are supposed to be good at. But instead of leading the debate on immigration, most, in all parties, I think, seem to be following what they think is public opinion, which we'll come on to with James in a moment.
And I think part of the explanation for Labour's caution on this is the so-called red wall that turned a blue wall, because those are the voters who are extremely likely to be suspicious about high levels of migration, and they have reason to be suspicious in that the Tories lied about that. I think it went up to something like 750,000 the year before last, and they promised to keep it at something like 150,000 net migration. So that was a betrayal of those voters who thought they were getting less migrants. However, I find it desperately upsetting that people speak of immigration only as a problem. I live in Hackney. I've lived in Hackney for 25 years. In my street, next door neighbours, from Caribbean background, across the road, Muslims, house on the corner, Hasidic Jewish. You know, it's total mix. That's one of the many things I love about Hackney. And the idea that these people are sponges, that they're not contributing to our society, many of them, as both of you have said, Stephen and Seb, are working in the NHS or at the care system. many of the shops are staffed by, sort of very, very long hours. Most the shops most nearby where you nip out. I went on Christmas Day to go and get some biscuits because I decided I couldn't be bothered to cook Christmas dinner and had cheese and wine instead.
Honestly.
And the shop on
what
the corner.
You like?
And the shop on the corner had cheese biscuits. So I just think, please, 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 can we acknowledge the enormous enrichment of our society? But I'm the daughter of an immigrant. I'm a mongrel. I haven't got a drop of English blood in me. I'm proud to be British, but, well, sometimes proud to be British, unfortunately less so in recent years, but I hope to be proud to be British again when we have a Labour government in power. And I find it very upsetting that there is this sense of we can't talk about this in anything but negative terms.
James, do politicians really understand public opinion on this, or are they playing to it?
No, I think they do understand it. I think the reason that there is a lack of the reason that politicians are talking about reducing immigration, as Chris asked, is because that's what voters want. Now, you can make the argument, well, you need to lead them on the merits of the case, but the immigration issue, building on what Seb said, has become a policy issue in itself. Because if people aren't listened to, if they let then concerns about immigration be known and they're repeatedly ignored, they will go and look for more extreme solutions. They will go to the right, and I don't just mean reform, they could even go further right than that. You can see where that's happened in Europe. You can see that with the rise of the AfD in Germany. You can see it in plenty of other European countries. If you don't address these concerns, then they will run away from you. This is the result of a failure over the last 14 years of Tory government to get on top of this issue. In our poll at the start of this week, we asked people whether they thought the Tory government had succeeded or failed on a range of policy issues. They thought they'd failed on every single one, but the one right at the bottom was immigration, and that is a real problem for them. Those voters, and all respect to Christina, people in places that are less built for high levels of immigration, places that aren't like Hackney, who have actually got a relatively small number of immigrants, but the pace of change has been very high. Those people feel real frustration real concern about the impact on housing, real concern on the health service, real concern on education, and they also have concerns about the culture and direction of their place too.
But why is it that places that have comparatively few immigrants tend to be places where the concern about immigration is at its highest?
Well, I think the answer is pace of change. So when you extrapolate those numbers, you're absolutely right. But when you look at the pace of change, how fast you've gone from 100 immigrants a year to 1,000, that tenfold increase might not look like much in numbers terms, but it has a huge impact, especially in some of these quite deprived areas in parts of the country which, as we've talked about, are now in the electoral battleground.
Or alternatively, it may not. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't, and I absolutely agree with Stephen that it has to be managed, and the Tories have completely messed this up. The idea that they were promising to reduce it to the tens of thousands and then we go up to 750,000, that's just a massive slap in the face for everyone, including the communities where schools and public services and doctor surgeries then get oversubscribed. But I've now forgotten what I was going to say.
Well, can I just come in there?
Very well.
Can I just come in there, Christina? Because you're talking. Go ahead then.
I've forgotten again. Go ahead, Seb. Go ahead.
I'll make the point.
Yeah, senior moments.
What I was going to say is that I think this is you can look at what's happened over the past 14 years, but this goes across several governments over many years. That if I can just get a tiny plug in here, I wrote a book a couple of years ago where I went around a lot of places that voted Conservative for the first time in 2019, the so-called Red War. And the thing that people kept saying to me time and again was, when did I vote for this level of change in my community? To what James was saying, when did I vote for this changing makeup? Now, people are understanding, they are tolerant, but they feel from going back to the 90s onwards, because up until the late 90s, we had net migration of tens of thousands, and then from the mid-2000s onwards, it exploded upwards, that no one's been able to have a good, serious conversation about this. But I think you've got to get control, you've got to manage it, and then you can have the positive conversation.
I agree. Can I say, I have now remembered what I was going to say. May I just say that I completely agree with that.
Oh, well, brilliant then.
And I'm half Swedish. Sweden obviously has had the Sweden Democrats from 2022, which has been, a kind of very significant, in my view, upsetting moment in Sweden's history, because immigration there has been a disaster. It's been appallingly managed with minimal integration and great ghettoisation and so on. But one thing about what you were saying about sort of increasing from 100 to 1,000. It may or may not add a strain to public services. And I agree that people need to feel that they have a voice in that and that they're playing a part in that. But the other issue is that if you feel that things are generally wrong in your community and the high street is dying and public services are in decline, then it's an easy and visible scapegoat.
You committed a basic error there, Seb. You didn't actually mention the title of your book.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, Broken Heartlands, a journey through Labour's lost England that may not be so lost in a couple of weeks' time. Available from Amazon and probably the works by this point.
8:49 is the time on LBC.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:51 is the time on LBC. Just to tell you, at 8 o'clock on Thursday, we're going to have a special election youth debate. All four participants will be under the age of 21. We're hoping to get representatives from either 4 or 5 parties. There's one party, shall we say, we haven't had many volunteers from that particular source yet, but I won't say which one. We asked for volunteers on the programme last night. We've had a lot, so do tune in for that on Thursday at 8. Somebody said we should also have a pensioner debate too. You never know. We might even do that. Now, here's a text question from Andrew in Worcester. Putin has turned up in North Korea to sign a new security deal with Kim Jong-un. Does this show that he's getting desperate to find new friends, or should we be afraid of this alliance? Now, both the US and South Korea claim North Korea have been supplying Russia with artillery for use in Ukraine, but the North Koreans deny they have any formal military arrangement with Russia. Stephen Timms, should we be afraid, or very afraid, or not at all afraid?
I don't think we should be surprised. I mean, I think the fact that there is an alliance between those two countries is quite well known. Perhaps there is a slight air of desperateness about it from Putin's point of view. He's become an international pariah, quite rightly, given what he's done. But, you know, those two countries between them do have the capability of doing a great deal of damage to others. So we need to be cautious and make sure that we keep safe.
Christina?
Yeah, I mean, as Stephen says, it's not a great surprise, but I think we should be quite afraid of Putin. I think he's quite a scary man, and the damage, what he's done in invading Ukraine has been horrific, and the fact that it's not on the front pages all the time doesn't mean that it's any less horrific, and it's not going terribly well for Ukraine. And the fact that American politics held up funding for so long, and if Trump gets in, we have even more reason to be afraid. So I think those alliances, and with Iran, and of course the relationship, the friendship with China and Xi Jinping is pretty frightening. And that's the reason, for example, that Sweden has joined NATO, because many European countries are feeling profoundly threatened, and they don't do that kind of thing lightly. So, yeah, it's not great.
James?
I think the interesting angle on this is China's role in this, because China is not necessarily completely happy with Russia having this relationship with North Korea and building up relationships that it can't control. So I think it will be looking to manage Russia's relationship too. Since the war in Ukraine, Russia has become much more dependent on China for getting around sanctions and for its export market. China has a lot of leverage over Russia, and I think that's the interesting dynamic in here. How comfortable China is with just how powerful Russia might get from a relationship like this.
So,
I think, to add on to that, what you're seeing is Putin trying to visibly show a different axis of influence across the world, because we see NATO and we see the Western powers who have remained very united on Ukraine up until this point. And notwithstanding what Christina was saying about Donald Trump, that every Western country has been very clear about supplying arms. They could have done more. We could have all done more. But there's been a clear intent there. And what Putin is trying to do is to show that we're not the only game in town. And you've got China as one element, and I think with North Korea, they're obviously international pariah for most people, but for Putin, why not? And I think you've seen, obviously, Kim Jong-un has also made visits to China in the past as well. So it is something to be worried about, and I think we should just try to remember that war is still going on, and it is going to be a long war, and we've reached almost stalemate at this point, that the Ukrainian troops are struggling to push back on the Russian advances, and Russia is gradually nibbling away at the Ukrainian forces. And what Putin's counting on is everyone just getting a bit tired of this fight, that the West's got so many of its own issues, notwithstanding as well the Israel-Gaza conflict that's taken a lot of the headlines in terms of international dispute. So when we see this image, we should use it to double down our resolve and remember that Putin is serious and he wants to win this thing. He's happy to even go and see Kim Jong-un to make it happen.
Right, brief answers on this question from Steve, who says, whose fault is it that the Tories are doing so badly in the polls? Now, James, you wrote yesterday in the Telegraph an article headlined, Rishi Sunak has doomed the Conservative Party. He must own his failure. Did you give similar advice to Theresa May in 2017?
Well, I ran the post-mortem into the election in 2017, and certainly Theresa May's presentation during that campaign did not help. I think we're on another level, though, of disaster with Rishi Sunak's campaign. Look, I do think Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are a lot of the responsibility for this. Boris Johnson started with that majority of 80, and through a litany of disasters that we don't need to revisit now, he's obviously put that in serious danger. But a lot of people had the hope and faith that Rishi Sunak might be able to turn it around, and he manifestly hasn't. And I think that's a personal failure. The two issues that cut through the most in the last week with the public were the continued fallout from his early exit from D-Day and his comments on Sky TV, that he wasn't able to afford it as a child. Those two things are not campaign blunders, they're personal blunders of the Prime Minister, and he's got to own the responsibility for that.
Christina?
I think all the Tory leaders since 2010 take blame, because David Cameron held the Brexit referendum for entirely for political reasons. It was not needed. It has had catastrophic effects on our country, and it has created an instability that has just accelerated. So there was I think all of them. I think Theresa May then took over from an impossible Brexit situation, messed it up, but it was very hard to get it right. Boris Johnson, absolute disaster. Liz Truss, disaster. Rishi Sunak, probably a relatively decent guy who unfortunately doesn't have good political instincts and is very bad on telly, and D-Day was a disaster. So I think they all bear responsibility, and I can't wait to see the back of them.
As you said several times so far. Sebastian Payne, aren't you glad you didn't become a Conservative candidate at this election? Because timing is everything, isn't it?
More or less glad than you, Ian.
Touche.
No, I'd say, look, obviously, well, we both sort of had a run at this and it didn't quite work out, and, you know, we're sitting here and it's always very easy.
The difference is you're young enough to try again.
Ian, I have faith that it will happen for you very soon. I think the fact is that when you're sitting here observing, it's very easy to pinpoint the blame on this, but I think Christina is actually possibly right. It is everyone has to share the blame for where this is at. But if you look at the polls and the polls that James has done, the moment when those polls started to drop was Partygate, and I know that's a long time ago, but from that point onwards, the Tories have never been ahead in the polls. It's been down all the way from there, and it broke a bond between the government and the voters.
Stephen, briefly, if you can.
I agree with Christina. I think it's been a disastrous 14-year record, and the Conservative Party is reaping the consequences of that. I think it's unfair to blame Rishi Sunak for it.
Right, our fun question comes from Naomi in Camden. Japan's emperor is making a state visit to the UK next week, but because the election campaign is on, he and the empress won't be making the usual trip to Downing Street. So in that spare hour or two the couple now have, where in the UK would you like to take them to instead? James.
Well, I'm going to slightly cheat here because I know something that the Japan Emperor is doing in his spare time. He wrote his PhD thesis on the River Thames, and he's obsessed with the Thames Barrier. So he's actually doing an excursion to go and see the Thames Barrier.
Is that your constituency?
There we go. Goodness me, the answer is Stephen's constituency. So, I would say, he's obviously going to enjoy that. There are some other sites he can see on the Thames, HMS Belfast perhaps. There's a Bronze Age jetty remains near Vauxhall that not many people know about. And, of course, plenty of pubs down the river too.
Stephen, I imagine you're already planning the photo op, aren't you?
Yeah. I'd like to bring somewhere else in. I'd like to bring to East Ham High Street, where I've been spending a lot of time over the last few weeks, because it is a very, very friendly place. And with two or three of us stand up in East Ham High Street. We've got a few leaflets, and within about a minute, people are coming along and saying hello, talking about their problems, complaining about what's going on. East Ham High Street being dug up by Thames Water for the last year and a half, and it's complete mayhem. But it's a very, very friendly place. And I think, if you want to get a sense for what London is like today, there's nowhere better. Come to East Ham High Street.
I think we'd better actually read out the list of candidates, given that you've kind of said where you are. So, Corey, if you can put that on the screen, I'd be very grateful. Seb.
I would take inspiration from Bill Brighton, who was Chancellor of my former university, Durham, who said that it is the unknown jewel in England's crown. You might need to get a helicopter to get there and back within an hour or two. But if he's got time, he would go up there, have a lovely walk around the cathedral, see the river, enjoy some pubs. And it's a very different side to England and not somewhere you would maybe normally go if you're the emperor.
Christina.
Durham is lovely, and we went to the same college there, Van Mildert.
All the best people.
However, I would say Hackney, because I think Hackney has lots of... What did you say?
Nothing.
Hackney has lots of beautiful green spaces. It has beautiful Springfield Park, Clissold Park, lots of the planting at the moment is beautiful. There's lots of kind of wild, meadowy spaces. There's the Lee irrigation, whatever you call it, Canal River. Lots of cafes, lots of lovely shops. I love it. It's my favourite. It's my favourite part.
You see, I would take him to somebody in between your constituency, Stephen, and Hackney, and that would be the London Stadium. But obviously, not much going on there at the moment. Right, the candidates in East Ham are Hilary Briffa, Liberal Democrat, Maria Higson, Conservative Party, Tahir Mirza, an Independent, Daniel Oxley, Reform UK, Rosie Pearce from the Green Party, Satish Mohan Ramados, an Independent, Anand Kumar Sundar, an Independent, and Sir Stephen Timms, Labour Party, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, it seems. It's a very long list there. Thank you very much to Sir Stephen Timms, Sebastian Payne, Christina Patterson and James Johnson for taking part in Cross Question. Coming up in the next hour, now this is a subject that comes up from time to time, but I think it's really relevant now because the BMA, who I normally disagree with on everything, have come up with a proposal that I actually agree with. They are urging the next government to cut the drink-drive limit so people can only consume one small glass of wine or beer before getting behind the wheel. The current legal limit for driving is 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood, or 0.08%. That was established in 1967. It's one of the highest limits in Europe. Scotland has halved it. Shouldn't England and Wales follow suit? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call here on LB.